Good evening. I'm Ann Eichinger, pastor here at Central Presbyterian, and we are glad to have you here this evening and to be able to host King University Faith and Culture Institute. This is an awesome opportunity for us, and this is a great space to be able to do that. So we are glad you are here. So the main thing that you probably want to know is where are the bathrooms. Down this hallway to your left. The first door on your left is men's, the second door is the women's. You are permitted to wear masks or not wear masks. We let you have that choice. But we are glad you're here, and I'm going to turn it over to Martin Donnerwine.
Thank you. Great to see you all out on a beautiful spring evening when you could be out enjoying a beautiful spring evening. But I'm glad you're here with us tonight because you are in for a treat with Kellie Brown and her exceptional research into music and the Holocaust. So we're delighted that you're with us tonight. I have a couple of announcements about the Institute, and I'm going to get our student Grayson Howe to do the introduction of Kellie in a moment. First of all, we still have a few of these floating around. Our annual schedule is on a bookmark, and the reason we did this was partly because it's a lot cheaper, and partly because we knew that there was a likelihood we would have changes to the schedule, and indeed we do. On the poster you see at the front, most of the things are wrong now in the recent memory, but they're all right here. So if you use your phone and you use the QR code, it'll bring you the correct schedule. For example, on the poster you'll see that for today there is a Hungarian physicist who looks very unlike Kellie. And so he was supposed to be with us. The United States Holocaust Museum in DC, we have partnered with for many years to bring in people from the Survivor Speakers Bureau, but they have not been able to travel since COVID. And I'm not sure whether that program is going to resume or not. But it's a wonderful fitting together to have Kellie come in to do her research instead today. We do have a flurry of activity. Oh, by the way, at the end of the talk, you have the opportunity to purchase the book. I will point out the length of this book she fought for. And she may tell you that story at some point, but it's because it's so full of good things. And she therefore won a struggle with the publisher to keep all those good things in the book. This is a tremendous repository of stories that are at the same time harrowing and heartening. And I strongly recommend it. We have several copies at the back. And she might, if you're nice to her, she might even sign one for you. I can't guarantee that, but she might do that.
As long as I don't have to talk about physics.
Okay. We have a no physics policy on the signing of the book, so appreciate your acknowledgement of that. Our remaining scheduling is all in the first week of April. It is an unusually packed week for us owing to some rescheduling. On April the 3rd, which is unusually for us a Sunday afternoon at King, and then on the morning of April 4th, our math professor Bill Linderman, who is an exceptionally fine pianist, has also been doing some composing, and he's going to perform his compositions for piano, flute, cello, and voice, both on Sunday afternoon and on Monday morning of the 3rd and the 4th. And then also unusually for us, we're doing a Thursday night and Friday morning, and that's to accommodate our third rescheduling of poet, singer, priest, and marvelous human being Malcolm Guite. And if you haven't encountered Malcolm before, you need to go to his blog site, listen to some of his songs, more importantly, read his poetry. Malcolm is a wonderful, accessible, and learned poet. Most of his poetry has to do with the church year. I often use it when I preach. He's very accessible and very wonderful stuff. So I encourage you to come hear Malcolm. Thursday night, he'll be doing poems and songs at Emmanuel Episcopal Church. And on Friday morning, the 8th, he will be at King during our normal chapel time on Friday the 8th, talking about theology and the imagination. So he's been rescheduled. Then we have one final event on April the 10th and 11th. This is our annual lecture in honor of the American writer Frederick Buechner. Buechner is the person for whom the entire institute was named initially. We now have an annual event honoring his work. His novels have been widely read. Godric is probably the most famous. He's also known for his memoirs, and this happens to be the 40th anniversary of Buechner's best-known memoir, which is called The Sacred Journey. And this is a memoir of his early years. It's been very widely read, and I encourage you to have a look at it. In fact, if you're here and you think you'd like to take part in this, we have free copies, and we'd love to give you one if you want to come and participate. On the 10th, we have our speaker, Jeff Monroe, who has a book called Reading Beekner. He's been a friend of the King Institute for many, many years. He used to be at Western Seminary. Jeff is going to speak on Monday the 11th, but on Sunday the 10th, he's going to do a book club style discussion of this book at King at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. And we'd love to have you take part in that. It's very low key. You won't have to, you won't be put on the spot. You can sit and enjoy it if you want. But we do have copies of the book that the Beekner family very kindly sent us. And if you would like a copy, we'll have those at the back at the end. It is the only thing I'm ever offering at the book table for free. I just want to point that out. Don't get used to this. This is not going to be the norm. The bookmarks are absolutely free. I want to point that out. Take 3. Take 7. Hand them out. Give them out. These, you could re-gift these, actually. Imagine how excited your friends and family would be when they get last year's schedule at their Christmas time. It's a great opportunity. We're also grateful, as always, to be here at Central. Grateful to those running the sound and video. Grateful to Ann and the entire congregation. Thank you all for hosting us in this great space. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm now going to ask Grayson Howe to come and introduce Kellie. I assume that was for me and not Grayson.
Hi, my name is Grayson Howe, and I'm a senior at King, and as a music education major myself, I am delighted to have this opportunity to introduce Dr. Kellie Brown. Dr. Kellie Brown studied violin performance and music education at Furman University and East Tennessee State University, where she received a bachelor's degree in music education. She also has a master's degree in violin performance from Appalachian State University and a doctoral degree in higher education administration with an emphasis in music administration from East Tennessee State University. Dr. Brown is the chair of the music department at Milligan University, as well as being a professor of music, a conductor of the Milligan University Orchestra. In addition to her service to Milligan University, Dr. Brown serves as a conductor of the Johnson City Symphony Orchestra. Dr. Brown is also a performer and has performed and conducted in several world premieres. She has a passion for musical theater and is an expert in this area as a conductor, director, and violinist. As a highly respected and knowledgeable teacher of 30 years, she has received numerous awards, including the Outstanding Teacher Award from the Tennessee Governor's School of the Arts and the Bristol YMCA Woman of the Year Award for the Arts. Dr. Brown is also a gifted writer who has published in numerous music educator journals. As an internationally recognized authority on music during the Holocaust, Dr. Brown has spoken at academic institutions and conferences such as the American String Teachers National Conference, the College Orchestra Directors Association International Conference, the Christian Fellowship of Arts Music Composers National Conference, and the Rosen International Holocaust Symposium. Dr. Brown's most recent book is titled The Sound of Hope, Music as Solace, Resistance, and Salvation During the Holocaust and World War II. Her book was released in 2020 and has since received a review from the Washington Post, who declared that she has succeeded admirably in bringing together in one volume so much important research. This evening, Dr. Brown will be talking to us about her book, The Sound of Hope. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kellie Brown.
Thank you, Grayson, for that introduction. And thank you, Martin and King Institute. Is this working? The switch on.
Go the other way with the switch.
All right.
All right, give it a second. There you go.
There you are.
Wow, there we go. All right, thank you to the Martin and the King Institute of Faith and Culture. They have been such gracious hosts today. I've had such a wonderful time being at King and speaking and meeting students and talking with colleagues there. One thing that people usually ask me first is, how did you get interested in music during the Holocaust and doing this research? There's a very long answer to that we don't have time for, so I'm going to give you the abridged version of it. And basically, that is 20 years ago, I read a biography of Alma Rose, who was an internationally renowned violinist from a very important family. I'll talk about her some more in a little while. And I found out that she was sent to Auschwitz, where she ended up being forced to conduct an orchestra of female prisoners there. And my connection as a violinist and her life just kind of, I felt so deeply entwined with her life and what happened there. And so that was my first introduction. And I spent a lot of time researching the women who were in that orchestra with her. And then over time, I began to look at other places and other musicians. So that's sort of how it came to be, really. It didn't start out to be a book. It just kind of happened that way. And I've really been focusing on bringing together the stories of people and places and objects. So we're going to look at those three different things and how, when they come together, that we end up with this powerful music that people found a way to find hope through. They found comfort through it. They found even a means of spiritual resistance. And sometimes I think even a measure of reconciliation, which I want to talk to also. And so in my research, not only did I see that music was so powerful in this positive way, but that music could be used, its power could be harnessed in an evil way, as a cog in the machinery of the Nazi genocide campaign. And that was horrifying to see that music, something so precious and dear, could also be used in that way. So there's a tension there that we have to hold these two things together. And Martin sort of alluded to that, the hopeful and the horrific that sort of go side by side. So as I talk about some people and places and objects tonight, I want you to think about 4 words. We're going to kind of talk to them about them in the context of 4 different words, and it is remembrance and resilience and resistance and reconciliation. So the first thing I want us to talk about for a second is remembrance. When Holocaust researchers talk together and write papers and go to conferences, one of the things we talk about is memory and legacy. How do you continue to hold memory, hold in trust this memory of what happened? How do you help the world to remember? Okay? That's really critical, right? We have so few Holocaust survivors left. And when we look at what's happening in our world today, you know, I had no idea that when I was going to speak here at King today, that themes from my book were going to be playing out on my television news right now. These same lessons and things that I discovered in my research are as relevant as ever today. We're seeing musicians play in bomb shelters to comfort people, and so we need these reminders. And so how do we do that? How do we go about remembering? What do we do with the fact that if we held 10 seconds of silence for every victim of the Holocaust, that we wouldn't speak for 5 years? What do we do with that? And so I'd like to share a quote about memory by Dr. Edith Eger, who was a Holocaust survivor. She was sent as a teenager to Auschwitz along with her parents and her sister. Only she and her sister survived. Dr. Eger says, "Memory is sacred ground, but it's haunted too. It's the place where my rage and guilt and grief go circling like hungry birds, scavenging the same old bones. It's the place where I go searching for the answer to the unanswerable question, why did I survive?" So we really see in her statement here this tension that I'm talking about. So let's think about resistance now. There are certainly many examples of physical resistance in the Holocaust. Think of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, but what I want to focus on is spiritual resistance. This kind of refusal to let the mind and the heart be taken away by those who intend to do you harm. The continuing to create beauty amid ugliness. This continuing to survive in the face of an enemy that wants to wipe you and your culture off the face of the earth. That's what I'm talking about. And I want to look at a quote by Victor Allman. Victor Allman was a Czech composer who was imprisoned in Terezin, and this is what he said about the arts. By no means did we sit weeping on the banks of the waters of Babylon. Our endeavor with respect to arts was commensurate with our will to live. And this is something that I found over and over again, this connection between continuing to create and surviving, that there was a connection there. Another musician that was imprisoned at Terezin, Alice Harriet Summers, said this: music was life. We did not, could not, would not give up. So that's the kind of resistance that I'm talking about. Let's think about resilience for a second. This is certainly a word that gets talked about a lot, like, what is resilience? What causes resilience? What cultivates it? We've talked about it during the pandemic, right? The keeping going despite things. What does resilience really mean? Well, Merriam-Webster says that this is resilience, an ability to recover from or adjust easily to misfortune or change. So there's a textbook definition. I like what Holocaust survivor Viktor Frankl had to say about the challenge of resilience. He said that it is continuing to live despite persistent world weariness. And he certainly knew about world weariness. He certainly had to live with what had been done to him in Auschwitz and what had been done to his family. And so that definition connects to me. And I want to show you some more words by Edith Eger, and this is about her take on resilience. I will always be a woman whose mother and father were gassed and burned and turned to smoke. I will always be what every person is, someone who will bear suffering. We can't erase the pain, but we are free to accept who we are and what has been done to us and move on. And of course, the final of my 4 R's for tonight is reconciliation. And I guess in some ways this is the hardest, because we think, how could there be any reconciliation about what would happen in the Holocaust? What was done in this incredibly dark history? And toward the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you maybe one possible path forward to that. So now we're going to turn to some stories about people and places and objects, and as we do, continue to think about these words, about how they relate to remembrance and to resilience and to resistance and maybe even reconciliation. So I want you to consider a group of objects. I have a little object collage here. So we have an accordion and a guitar and a piece of music and a violin and a baton and a cello and a piano. So these objects are going to find themselves in the hands of people who are in horrific places, in Auschwitz, in Terezin. And in these hands, these objects are going to become, in some ways, transformative. So the first place I want us to go to is to go to Auschwitz, which is, of course, the most notorious of the camps, a place of torture and depravity and murder, and also a place where music was heard daily. There was so much music in Auschwitz. The Nazis forced musician prisoners to play in orchestras. It's the only real example I know of in history where there is compulsory music labor, forced music labor at gunpoint. And there were so many musicians in the camp, and there ended up being 3 orchestras. And so why would this take place? Why would they force these prisoners to make music? Well, there are lots of different reasons. One is that the Germans loved music, and they wanted to be surrounded by music. They wanted to have concerts. They wanted to be entertained. Another reason is more functional. Every morning they made the prisoners line up to be counted and to march out to work, and then in the evenings they had to march back. And so they wanted a musical cadence so this could be done synchronously. So the orchestras were there at the gate to play morning and evening marching music. And if you can imagine, this didn't make these orchestra members very popular among their fellow prisoners, who would often spit at them or hurl insults at them. But these prisoners playing music were as helpless as anyone else. They had no choice in this. They either played or they would be killed. And this is where Alma Rose fits into the story that I told you I learned about her first. So she's this talented violinist in Vienna. She's coming from a musically elite family. Her uncle was Gustav Mahler, the great composer and conductor. Her father, Arnold Rose, was the concertmaster of the Vienna Philharmonic and had been for 50 years. She was really just getting into the early peak of her career when the Nazis took over Austria. And so she gets sent to Auschwitz just for being Jewish. And when she arrived at the camp, there's always this selection process that happens, and people get sorted in different directions. If you look old or too weak to work or sick or you're a child, you're probably going to be taken directly to the gas chambers. And one of the people who do this kind of sorting is Dr. Mengele, a very notorious figure. So Alma Rose enters in the camp, and she gets assigned to go to block 10. And that is the experimental medical block where Mengele is doing his experiments. And she walks into this room, and she sort of looks around and right away realizes what's happening here, and she thinks, I'm going to die here. And because she had this realization, she asked for a violin to be brought to her. She wanted solace of her music here in what she felt like were her final days. And you think, a prisoner making any demands? But she was a well-known prisoner. Okay, they knew about her and they knew about her family, and sure enough, they brought her a violin. And she began to play for the women who were in this medical block, who were being subject to these horrific experiments. And every night when the workers had gone home, she would give concerts for them, and it meant so much to them. And in return, the prisoners who were working in the office there made sure that her name stayed off of the experiment list. And so that went on for a few weeks, but you couldn't keep her and her violin a secret for very long. And so eventually, Maria Mondo, who was head of women in the camp, found out that Alma Rose was in the camp. And so she ordered her to be transferred to the music block. And so Alma, at this point, is handed a baton and said, here's a group of women musicians, and we want them to sound like a good orchestra. Well, they weren't a good orchestra. And unlike the men, where most of them had been playing in professional orchestras, women weren't allowed to be in professional orchestras during this time period. So most of the women that they had put together were amateur musicians or folk instruments. Alma Rosé walks in, and here's some people playing the mandolin and the guitar, and here's a flute, and here's just some random instruments. And she's supposed to make them sound like a good group. But here's what she figures out early on. That if the Nazis are satisfied with this group of women, that she has a way forward to save their lives. So she begins to get as many women in here as she can. She begins to teach them and work with them so that they can sound better musically. And she begins to leverage the fact that the Nazis want this music with the need of the women. And she begins to get some extra food rations and a stove in their barracks. So she begins working on that. But it's not easy, and conditions are really rough. And she has no music for this assortment of instruments. She has to write everything. And so she stays up all night writing arrangements for them to play. And in a short period of time, they have a repertoire of 200 pieces. It is just amazing. And so I want to tell you about two of the women that Alma saved. So Esther was sent to Auschwitz in 1943. She was 17 years old. When the Nazis began to recruit musicians, they summoned her because they had heard that she was a pianist. But at this point, they had no piano. And so they said, here's what we have. We have an accordion. You can audition on this accordion, and if you can play it, you can be in the orchestra. Esther had never held an accordion in her hand in her life, and they gave her 60 seconds to figure out how the thing worked. And she said she was very motivated to figure out how to keyboard here, chords here, air, and she was able to do enough that they invited her into the orchestra. Also at 17, Anita Losker-Wallfisch came to Auschwitz. She was in line getting her head shaved and a number tattooed on her body, and the prisoner who was being forced to do this work just began to make small talk with her and said, "What do you do?" And Anita says, "I play the cello." And she got an unexpected response. "Fabulous, you'll be saved." Told Anita to wait over here to the side. And Anita said she was standing over to the side, having had her head shaved, and she was naked. And she was just holding a toothbrush in her hand, and said, in a little while, an elegant woman began to come toward her. She said this woman was a prisoner, but there was something unique about her. She wasn't your average prisoner. And the woman began to quiz her and say, "Do you indeed play the cello?" And she said yes, and she recited people she had studied with. And the woman said, "My name is Alma Rosé, and you are going to join the orchestra." And so that was an invitation to life. Not only did Esther survive the war.
I'm sorry, hang on.
Okay.
It's back here. Sorry, I'm not sure what happened.
Okay. So not only does Esther survive the war, but she continues to play the accordion. It becomes her kind of life's work to play the accordion. When she is in her 80s, she's playing in a band called the Microphone Mafia. So she was like way hipper in her 80s than I've ever been. And in October 2020, she won the Hermann Maas Prize for a lifetime achievement in working for social and racial justice. And she lived until, are things happening? Until this past July. She just passed away. She was 97 years old.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. Anita also survived. Anita is still alive. She is 96. She was in the news about a month ago because she's living in England, and Prince Charles had commissioned some paintings of Holocaust survivors, and one of the paintings was of her. Yeah, and so she has been an amazing advocate of social justice. She has been bearing witness ever since she was 17 years old. And when I talked to Anita, the thing that I saw from her was an incredible weariness that she had, because her whole life has been defined by being a Holocaust survivor, and she has had to tell her story over and over and over again. And she's had to deal with what we think of as survivor guilt. And she said, we played with, guns in our back and tears in our eyes. And so that was their experience there. So how are we doing with
I don't
our
know.
slides?
Hang on. I may have to turn it off and start over.
Oh, okay.
Keep going. You're fine.
Okay.
I'm
It's a little
sorry.
hard to keep going with that.
I'm sorry.
The slides.
I apologize.
We'll catch up. Okay, so we're going to travel a little bit. We're going to leave Auschwitz, and we're going to go to a POW camp. This is Stalag 8A. It's a prisoner of war camp located sort of on the border between Poland and Germany. And a lot of Allied soldiers who were captured by the Germans were sent to this POW camp. And here in this POW camp was a very famous composer named Olivier Messiaen. But who I want to talk about is a violinist that showed up in this camp named Max Becker. Max had grown up in Lithuania. He had studied the violin at the Vilna Conservatory, but then had been drafted into the Polish army. And it wasn't very long until the Germans arrested him, and he was sent to this POW camp. And he found out that they had an orchestra there, and he wanted to play violin in the orchestra. So he talked to the conductor of this group and said, "I'd like to play in your orchestra." And he said, "Well, I'm going to have to get permission from the commandant because you are Jewish." But the commandant did grant permission for Max to be in the orchestra because he was an amazing violinist. So he became the first chair in this orchestra. And he played for 2.5 years in this POW orchestra. But then we get to near the end of the war, and the Germans realize that they're losing, right? And so we know what begins to happen. They began to sometimes let prisoners go. So they let a bunch of POWs go, but they refused to let the Jewish ones go. So Max and some of his fellow Jewish POWs were put on a death march. And they were a group of starving inmates up in the mountains, and the American troops found them. And so the Americans took Max to a place called St. Ottilian. And St. Ottilian was a Benedictine monastery before the war. And the Nazis had come in and sort of commandeered this monastery and turned it into a military field hospital. And so at the end of the war, then this hospital started to be used to recuperate people who had been liberated from concentration camps. There were about 400 people that had been in Dachau and were near death. And so Max gets brought to St. Ottilian. And he meets a lot of fellow musicians there, including a woman named Fanya Dermashkin, who had also grown up in Vilna and had studied piano at the Vilna Conservatory. And so they met there and they fell in love. And they also formed an orchestra with the other people who were musicians in this camp, and they called themselves the Ex-Concentration Camp Orchestra. that was their name. And they wore uniforms that looked like the striped uniforms from the camps. They wanted to remind the people listening to them of where they had been. And so they began to, first of all, give concerts just for the people who were recovering there at St. Ottilia. Then they began to give some concerts for the American troops. Then all of a sudden they had a bus and they were traveling around. They went and gave a concert at the Nuremberg Opera House for those who were running the Nuremberg war crime trials. And then a 29-year-old conductor, you might have heard of him, Leonard Bernstein, showed up and guest conducted 2 concerts with them, including with himself sitting at the piano and playing Rhapsody in Blue. Yeah, I can't imagine that. And so this orchestra, though, was meant to be temporary, right? These people were countryless at this point, right? They had lost their homelands, they had lost their citizenship, they had lost so many family members. They were in a very transitional time. And so by 1949, the orchestra says, okay, we've served our purpose, and they disband. And so Max Becker and Fania decide to come to the United States. And they come to Brooklyn, and it becomes their adopted home. And they marry. And their daughter, Sonia, is a very good friend of mine. And I had met her through my research, and she shared with me the story of her parents. And it's been such a meaningful relationship for me to be able to tell her parents' story. The final place that I want, well, I'm going to move next to,
Hang on one sec. We're getting
Are we
close.
close?
We're getting close.
we'll start the countdown.
Yeah.
No,
No.
that's it, right? We'll start the countdown.
Start at 100 maybe, but.
Okay. I wasn't supposed to do advanced math, right?
No, you're not.
Yeah, that's in my contract writer, right? But that's not what I'm doing. Yeah. My students laughed about that the other day because I gave them a handout that said, you need to do 4 of these 7 things. And they said, where's the 7th thing? There's 6. I'm like, what are you talking about? Yeah. There was 6. One of the things when I was working on this book, at first I thought, okay, this is just going to be a story about the Holocaust, about Jewish musicians. And then I also began to think about a group of women and children who had been taken prisoner by the Japanese and put on an island in Sumatra, and that they had formed a vocal orchestra there. And I thought, I can't leave their story out. So that also gets included in my book. So following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese began to, of course, sweep through the South Pacific and take over all these islands, right? And the islands were populated by a lot of Dutch and English colonists. And so the Dutch and the English colonists then began to flee, and a lot of them went to Singapore. And Singapore was considered to be a place that was really impenetrable. It's not going to fall to the Japanese. And then that turned out not to be the case. Okay, the Japanese were swiftly taking land, and by February of 42, it became clear that Singapore was going to fall. So the English government finally said, okay, we are going to evacuate the women and children and civilians, and we're going to put them on ships. Well, they didn't really have any good warships, so they just got some cargo ships, and hooked one gun on the side, and we're ready to go. And 2 of the women who were going to be evacuated from Singapore were musicians. One's name was Nora Chambers, and Nora was a violinist. She had studied at the Royal Academy of Music in London, and she was living in Malaya and teaching violin. She was there with her family, and And she's part of the group that had fled to Singapore. Living in Singapore was an English missionary named Margaret Dryburgh. She was an organist, a choir director. She was there as a Presbyterian missionary. She was a missionary to the Chinese population that was living there in Singapore. And so these two musician women get boarded onto separate cargo ships to escape. And what they don't know is that it's too late. The Japanese are lying in wait for them. They've got their warships in the water, they're ready with their planes, so their evacuation ships get out in the middle of the water, and then here come the Japanese and they begin to bomb them and take them captive. And Nora's ship is hit with 6 bombs, destroys almost all the lifeboats. Everybody's just in the water, floating around, trying to grab hold of something. The oil from the ship has leaked out into the water, and then the hot tropical sun comes down on them, and they're just floating in these currents that are so awful. And the lucky people really were only floating around in the currents for about, I don't know, 8, 9 hours. Some people were in the water for 60 hours in these conditions, and they eventually kind of wash up on the shore of this island called Becker Island out in the South Pacific. And so the Japanese are now in possession of all of these civilian women and children and men, and they've got to do something with them. So they take them to the island of Sumatra, and they separate them out, and they put the men in an internment camp, and they take the women and children and they put them in an internment camp. And they are in just desperate straits. They have hardly any food. There are all these tropical diseases like malaria, and they're sick and they have no medicine. They have no relief from the heat. Sometimes they are given a bag of dry rice, and it's full of glass and rock and all kinds of other things, and they have to pick it apart, one grain at a time. And yet, Nora and Margaret decide that they're going to have music. Now, unlike in the Nazi concentration camps where there were instruments, people usually ask me, where do these instruments come from? Well, when people were being sent to the camps, they could take things with them, right? And the Nazis hoped they would take things that were valuable, right? Because they were all confiscated. The Nazis were also all the time looting, right? They were taking valuables and paintings and artwork and instruments. So there were storehouses full of all that stuff. But out in this tropical island, there was nothing. So Margaret had this idea, what if we wrote out piano and orchestral music and we sang it without words but with just oohs and ahs? And this was going to be helpful because there was a language barrier here. There were all kinds of languages being spoken by the women in the camp. Now, how could this be possible? How could you write out these things? Well, the way you could do that is because Margaret had an eidetic memory for music. Anything that she had ever heard, she could begin to write out. So they found some scraps of paper, and she began to write out in 4-part harmony Dvorak's New World Symphony, the Largo Movement, Chopin's Raindrop Prelude, a long list of classical things. So Nora's job, while Margaret wrote out the parts, was to recruit some singers. So she went around and got a group of singers together. Now the Japanese had forbidden them to congregate. So they thought, we are going to have to rehearse in secret. So they did. At night, by the light of one lone bulb, they began to learn their parts. And then in December of 1943, this group gave its first concert. And the beautiful music that came kind of from this wordless chorus did so much to uplift the spirit of those women and children who were prisoners here. And surprisingly enough, the Japanese did not interfere with the concert. And as soon as the concert was over, everybody wanted another concert, right? Right away. It's okay if you do the same pieces, just give us another concert. So Margaret set out to remember more music. Okay.
All right.
Wow.
Oh, you're doing it back here. Hang on. I got it. I am so sorry. We'll get this.
Okay. I can talk for a long time. I have all kinds of stories. Yeah. We'll just be here for the long haul. No, I won't do that to you. So Margaret did. She began to write more pieces from memory, and so they performed them. But soon, conditions got so bad in the camp, and there was so much sickness and death that the orchestra ceased to be. So now we're going to rewind in time. Okay, this is the quiz part. See if you remember what I said a few minutes ago before we had slides. So do you remember Esther and Anita? There you go, yes, who lived into her 90s this past July. Anita still alive. Here's the Stalag 8A POW camp. Seated there is Max Becker with his violin. Here's a picture of that. Would you believe that those are all POWs? Don't they look like just a professional orchestra sitting there? You can see Max, he's the concertmaster there. This is the monastery I told you about, St. Ottilian, where they went to recuperate. Yeah, there's Max and Fania, who met and became part of this ex-concentration camp orchestra. Really helps to see photos. Whoops. This is a picture from the evacuation of Singapore. And this is Nora and Margaret, who we're talking about right now. So Margaret is the one that can recall everything that she's ever heard and write it out in parts. And so Nora is our conductor and our recruiter of singers. Somebody at dinner mentioned Paradise Road. There was a film made about them in which Glenn Close stars in it and plays Nora Chambers. These are two of the ships. Nora was aboard a ship called the Viner Brook trying to escape to England, and Margaret was on the Matahari. And if you'll see to the right of Sumatra, you'll see this little island called Bangka Island. And after they were bombed into the water, that's where they began to wash ashore, and then were eventually taken over to where you see right there in the middle of Sumatra. One of the things that happened in this camp is, like the Nazis were obsessed with counting the prisoners, the Japanese were too, a process they called tanko. They would blow a shrill whistle and all the prisoners would have to run out and in the heat and take a deep ceremonial bow to Hirohito. It was supposed to be an honorary bow to the Emperor of Japan. And a lot of the women remarked that to survive this, they just pretended in their minds that they were bowing to God, or that they were bowing to their favorite composer. You know, something in your mind that would help you to get through this kind of abuse. This is a picture of the hand-copied part from Dvorak that Margaret made for them to sing from. Margaret sadly did not survive this camp. Nora did live to see the liberation of the camp and went on to live until the 80s. The final place that I want us to look at tonight is Terezin, that's its name in Czech. The Germans called it Theresienstadt. It's right outside of Prague. This is one of the most unusual places in the whole Nazi camp system. When the Nazis took over Czechoslovakia, they were left with all of these musicians and artists and members of the intelligentsia in the Prague region, and they're like, what are we going to do with these people? They're kind of well known in the world, and so they finally decided, we're going to ship all of these people to this place called Terezín, and we're going to call it a ghetto. Okay, but it wasn't a ghetto. It was a concentration camp. So all of a sudden you have these people who are sent here, and they're all artists. And so now they're in this place with horrible conditions, right? They're starving, there's rampant disease, there's no medication, and there's also the constant fear of deportation because trains are coming in and out of there all the time and taking them to the extermination camps in Treblinka and Auschwitz. So this is what they're living in, and yet in the midst of all of this, there was music. There were these performers and composers and conductors, and they made music. And at first they made music in secret, and I told this morning the story of a cellist who was being sent to Terezín, and he took his cello apart in all kinds of pieces and hid it in his luggage, in his clothes, and took glue. And then he glued his instrument back together when he got into the camp. This is what music meant to them. But in time, the Nazis had an idea. They thought, you know what? We can actually use this to our benefit. If they're playing really good music, we could use this for propaganda. We could convince the world that the Jews are being treated well. And they did. The International Red Cross came to inspect the camp, and they were presented with these choreographed concerts and many other things, and they were deceived. They believed the charade. And one of the survivors from this camp was asked much later, why do you think the world so easily believed this? And he said, the world believed this because they wanted to believe it. It was easier. And that's certainly true. One of the people in Terezín who was making music was Ilsa Weber. Before the war, Ilsa was a children's author, but she also was a musician. She played a lot of string instruments, so the guitar and the lute and the mandolin. She was sent to Terezín along with her young son and her husband. And when she got here, she began to realize that they were in a horrible place, and she wrote a letter to a friend, and she said, we are dancing on a powder keg here. And she was assigned to take care of the children in the infirmary. So there were lots of children in Terezín. About 15,000 children were housed there during the war years. And so she was to attend to the sick children, and she was not given any medication for them. So what she began to do for them was to write poems for them, to compose lullabies, to sing to them, and to play the guitar and the lute. And she wrote a poem called Musica Prohibited. And this is part of her poem. I wander through Theresienstadt, a policeman's glance makes my flesh crawl. The lute I found is concealed, held tight, wrapped like an infant in a shawl. My heart beats fast, my cheeks are hot, I dread his probing eyes. If he discovered what I've got, they'll take the lute I prize. And then the poem concludes with, music is a beatitude. It is there salvation lies. Fearlessly I tote my lute beneath the policeman's eyes. In 1944, the Nazis announced that they were sending all the children in the infirmary to Auschwitz. rather than have them go alone, she volunteered to go with them and with her son. And they were sent to the gas chambers upon arrival. Her husband survived the war and was able to hide all of her poems and songs and then retrieve them after the war. And they were just recently published, and that's why we have them. They actually were published after I'd written my book, so I don't have Ilsa in my book. But there are always more stories to discover. And one of the things that she read that really relates to what I was talking tonight about the resistance is she said, "Let them try our spirits more. From the dust we shall arise." The last musician I want to talk about is Alice Herz-Sommer. She was one of the most talented musicians that was sent to Terezin. She was a pianist. She gave over 100 piano recitals, all from memory, in Terezin. She taught piano lessons to the children in secret. Educating them was also illegal. She had been sent to Terezin with her mother and her husband and her 6-year-old son, Rafi. Music actually saved her and her son, literally. Trains were leaving all the time, but yet Alice and Rafi kept remaining in Terezin. One day, a young German guard came up to her and he said, "I love your piano music, and I listen outside the window when you're playing, and I've made sure that your name and your son's are never on the deportation list." So Alice and Rafi survive, but her husband and her mother do not. And I do want to say at this point that as I'm talking about musicians and moments that brought hope and resilience and resistance, this was not the case for every person. Music did not bring comfort for every person. Some people, it was a gift that was stolen from them. It was tainted. And if they survived the war, some people never played music again. One violinist in Auschwitz, he was French, and he was forced to play the French national anthem while the Nazis were hanging a French prisoner. And for 2 days, he could not cope with how his music had been used. And he took his own life in the camp. Alice not only survived, but she thrived. When she died in 2014, she was 110 years old. Yeah, she was the world's oldest Holocaust survivor. When she was 109, she was still practicing the piano every day, playing Bach and Beethoven from memory. She was amazing. And despite all that had happened to her, all that had been taken from her, she displayed an incredible resilience. She said, "Life is beautiful. You have to be thankful that we are living. Wherever you look is beauty. I know about the bad things, but I look for the good things." Isn't that an amazing philosophy to have? Yes. I mentioned at the beginning that I would attempt to say something about reconciliation in my conclusion, and I want to do that. And I want to offer the idea that these objects, that these musical instruments could be living artifacts that continue to speak for people who no longer are here, who no longer can tell their story, that these instruments can continue to be a musical witness. And one of the greatest ways that is happening is through the Violins of Hope project that is running by Amnon Weinstein, who is a violin maker in Tel Aviv, Israel. His father had fled from the Nazis and come to Palestine and set up a violin shop. And he thought, wherever there are Jews, there are violins, which is true. And he's like, I'm going to start a business. I'm going to take care of violins. And he taught his son. And what happened is, as some Jewish musicians were fleeing Europe and coming to Palestine, They had instruments with them, and a lot of them were German instruments, and they no longer wanted to play them. And some of them were destroying the instruments. So Amnon's father took them and began to just store them in a back room. And one day Amnon was working in the shop, and this elderly man came in with a violin, and he said, "I played this violin in Auschwitz, and I want to get it restored. I want to give it to my grandson." And so Amnon said the violin was in really bad shape, and so he took it to the back, and he began to take the top off the instrument. And when he took the top off the instrument, the inside, the hollow inside of the violin was full of ashes. It was the human ash that had rained down as this man had been forced to sit outside and play the violin at Auschwitz. And it was a life-changing moment for Amnon. And he began to collect violins that were played in the Holocaust. And these would combine with this collection in the back room that his dad had become to collect. And so now these violins travel all over the world, and they give concerts and educational programs, and they're here to teach about the dangers of intolerance and hatred and prejudice, and to show us how the arts can be so vital in peace and goodness and spreading this around the world, lessons that we desperately need. Just this last fall, they were in Virginia. Yeah. So look up Violins of Hope, find where they're coming. I know there's at least one person here that saw them when they were in Knoxville, right before pandemic. Yeah, it's wonderful. I want to revisit this violin that I showed you on that first object collage. This violin has been on a journey to become part of the Violins of Hope collection. It is the same violin that is seen here in the hands. Yeah, that's Max Becker's violin. His daughter Sonia has given his violin to Amnon. And during the pandemic, he has been carefully and painstakingly restoring this violin. And I've kind of had a front row seat to this. He's been sending me photos and videos of him working on it. And it's a fine violin, and now it's so beautifully restored. And this last fall, you can see it here being played by the concertmaster of the Richmond Symphony. And so this is what I'm going to say is reconciliation, is a living artifact. This violin is an agent, I think, of not only remembrance and resistance and resilience, but also reconciliation. Thank you.
In a quickly huddled conference, we decided to leave questions for now since we're a little bit long, and we do want to have time for people to have a chance to get a book signed, and greet Kellie. Thank you for coming out tonight. Please do stop by the book table, and again, if you want one of the Beaker books, take one of those. Please join me again in thanking Kellie Brown.